Hi Blood Bowl fans, King Ghidra here, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Blood Bowl 20 through the lens of league play, tabletop league play, and drawing on some experiences of having played effectively 2 full seasons in London's 2 greatest leagues, the biggest league in London, the DBL, and the oldest league in London, the ECBBL. There's been a hell of a lot of learning across those 2 leagues and new ways of looking at a lot of the changes to Blood Bowl 20 that were purely being theory crafted before people had a chance to really play a lot of games in the new system. So loads of things to look at in terms of how the league meta and the league experience is going to change for people in the new world of BB20. So let's jump right in. So we're going to start with the elephant in the room here, and if you've played Blood Bowl second season edition in any kind of format, whether it's tournament play or league play or whatever, in any format that allows the stars, then you'll probably be aware that stars are a truly dominant and perhaps oppressive force in Blood Bowl 20. And the same has very much been true for the league experience. Of the 2 leagues that I have played in, DBL allowed all stars without any limitations, and ECBL actually had a blanket ban on stars because, I guess to a certain extent, they were forewarned about the impact that they would possibly have on the league experience. But as I say, if you've played Blood Bowl 20 in any format, then you'll probably be well aware that stars have had an enormous impact on competitive play of all variations, and in fact Games Workshop themselves were forced to acknowledge this in the most recent FAQ by bumping up the star prices, by bumping up the prices of 2 of the most commonly seen stars, and 2 arguably the most effective stars, which was Morg and Hackflem. So in terms of how these can influence league play, obviously there's 2 main ways in which you are likely to see stars of any variety. One is through what you might call the normal inducement system, where one team has a higher TV than their opponent for whatever reason, and the other is a more particular problem for league play, and that is teams that purposely start or attempt to perpetuate low TV on their roster so that they can gain inducements on a match-by-match basis, and probably intentionally to try and actually get hold of those stars. Now, the worst offenders on that front would be snotlings, and to be honest, I could probably talk about the impact of snotlings in the DBL for a large portion of this video, because the way that they play and the way that they play the inducements game and the impact that that has on the league meta and the league experience has been a really big and interesting thing about DBL this season, and it touches on multiple areas of the league experience. But just talking purely about the star element of it, the fact is that if you are facing the likes of Hackflem and Morg every game at low TV, which is where, you know, typically tabletop league play is conducted, and just to be clear about this, both DBL and ECBL play a pretty similar format, which is, you know, 8 to 10 games, fresh 1K TV teams, and so what you're looking at is a low TV kind of Blood Bowl, and a TV which, you know, might start to approach the kind of 1300, 1400, 1500 at season end, depending on how teams are developed. But for the most part, effectively looking at teams that don't have huge numbers of skills. You're talking about a lot of teams who can't start with their all of their positionals out of the gate because they simply can't afford them. And when you throw in fully formed, very powerful star players into that kind of environment, not surprisingly, they can have a really huge impact. Mighty Blow +2 on Morg has obviously been a huge offender, and again, this doesn't really it doesn't really matter what kind of Blood Bowl format you play in. That's just an incredibly powerful thing to have on the field. And similarly with Hakflem being an AG 2+ and movement 9 player, that's an insane piece to have available for any team as a ball carrier and even as a kind of deep blitzing threat. Not surprisingly, these 2 stars and some others, and I would pick out Griff as another example, had a very significant impact in the experience of playing against teams that could induce those in the early part of the season in DBL. In fact, for the most part, they were very, very oppressive, very, very powerful, very effective. People could not counter them. People could not stop getting destroyed by them. People could not stop Hakflem scoring touchdowns. So that is a big deal. And I would say that Games Workshop's acknowledgement of it and an attempt to make that situation a little more difficult by bumping up player prices barely touches the problem here. And why do I say that? Well, for one thing, they've only touched 2 of the worst offenders, and arguably the points increase they gave to Hakflem still doesn't really make much difference as to whether you would take him or not. If you can, and you're one of those kinds of teams that can use a AG2+ MA9 ball carrier or strength 3 blitzer for the same purpose, it's still a no-brainer. He's ridiculously good. Furthermore, they haven't touched any of the other stars who were also offenders, and I already mentioned Griff, but I would say, you know, Carla, Zug, all really good, and even again some of the more expensive ones. Deep Root is still incredible. So there's really a whole world of problems relating to stars out there that GW haven't done anything about at this point. And if you are playing league play in any format that allows stars and allows teams to play an inducement game whereby they can expect to have enough inducements available on a game-by-game basis to be picking from these stars, then you are going to see them, and they're going to have a very disproportionate effect on how those games play. So where does that leave leagues in terms of dealing with stars? Well, obviously, as per the ECBL approach, you can just ban them. And I do think there is actually some merit to that. The problem is that, as I said in the original framing of the situation here, there is, of course, the valid scenario where someone is playing down TV for whatever reason. Maybe their team got smashed to bits. Maybe someone else's team has just developed very powerfully and has got lots of skills or whatever. And, you know, they do need to have access to inducements to help level the playing field. And if you take stars out of the equation, that can leave the cupboard a little bare in terms of what's available to teams who are just trying to compete. So I think any person planning to run a league needs to have a really good think about what you do with stars. I think there are a number of possible approaches. So one might be just blanket increases in stars cost. So take the GW approach and apply that to a number of your other star players in your league, and just bump the cost up for all of them, or, you know, make taking any star cost 50k more, or whatever. Some other approaches is perhaps just to actually ban particular stars, maybe particularly egregious ones like Hakflem and Morg. Some other creative approaches that we've heard is that perhaps, you know, every team can only induce each star once a season, for example. So if you're one of those teams that's running at low TV, maybe you end up having to, you know, go through the gamut of all the stars during the season. I think that's quite a nice idea. Obviously, the problem there is that the coach can still kind of pick and choose the games for which they want to use what are evidently going to be the most powerful stars, and the ones where they don't need to have the full power at their disposal because it might be an easier fixture or whatever. Okay. But there are obviously a number of different approaches that can be taken, but I would certainly suggest that if you are running or playing in a league that allows stars, you very much need to be cognizant of their impact. If you are a commissioner, you need to have a very long think about how you want to manage stars and what rules you could maybe put in place to deal with them, because otherwise they really will have, in my experience, a disproportionate impact on how the league plays out. So another important aspect of league play, and one which I covered a little bit in a previous video, is the way that fan factor or dedicated fans now works in Blood Bowl second season edition. I think per my theorising, I kind of came to the conclusion that dedicated fans was really good if you were able to invest in it, and it would certainly give you very good returns over the course of a season. And the experience that I would say I've had in the leagues I've played in is that has absolutely been borne out. And for those teams that can invest money in dedicated fans, they are seeing fantastic returns. They have plentiful supply of cash, which of course means that they can recover from injuries, buy all of their positionals, get all of their rerolls, get any extra coaching staff, apothecaries, and all of those kinds of things. And this has led to some interesting situations in leagues where you have an imbalance, where teams have not been able to invest in dedicated fans in their starting rosters for various reasons. And of course there are some teams who are naturally more expensive, so all of the elves fall into that category certainly. And a team like Wood Elves, for example, which is really struggling to find a way of getting some positionals, 11 players, and some rerolls when it builds a starting roster, has very little wiggle room in order to invest money in dedicated fans. Now that's a big problem, because if you find yourself in a league situation where your opponents have also not invested in dedicated fans, then you will not see very good returns from your winnings unless you are in the happy position of being able to score a huge amount of touchdowns every game. But this, I think, is one of the key factors about the new fan factor dedicated fans experience in BB20. It's very much a system that depends on how your opponents have also approached it. And again, per the kind of theory crafting before this, it's very obvious that there was a kind of almost like a prisoner's dilemma kind of situation with dedicated fans, where if everyone takes the right approach, if everyone invests in it, everyone thinks the best of the community, everyone's prepared to give, then everyone wins. But when you have teams who don't invest playing other teams that don't invest, then everybody loses. And what you can have, if you just have a situation where you mainly play teams with low dedicated fans, and other people who've been able to invest money in dedicated fans are playing mainly teams that have also invested in dedicated fans, and you get a big disparity in winnings across the league, and certain teams are absolutely just rolling in money, and certain teams are really scrabbling around for it. Now this is particularly important because of the changes to damage in Blood Bowl second season edition. I want to talk about that separately, but all I will say is, from my perspective, I think money is as important as ever, if not more important, and investing in dedicated fans is an absolutely fantastic way of ensuring that you have as much money at your disposal as possible. So that was, I would say, is very much a lesson learned. If you're able to build your roster and put money into dedicated fans, you should absolutely do so, in my opinion, especially as always, if you are one of those teams that needs to buy rerolls, needs to buy further positionals, and perhaps particularly, in fact, is likely to be taking damage through the season. So I just want to touch on one other aspect of cash, and that is that hoarding cash and the penalising of it through expensive mistakes got made actually more easy in Blood Bowl second season edition. And again, this is something which is perhaps favoured those kind of stunty teams like Snotlings that were trying to play the inducements game, that built low TV rosters, had big pots of cash sitting at the start of the season. Expensive mistakes occurs mainly at higher increments of cash than it used to. So actually hoarding cash is easier than ever. And again, I think this is one of those factors which has helped those teams in playing the kind of game that they want to play. So just another thing to bear in mind again when you're running a league. Yeah. So touched on it a minute ago, and I think this is a really huge change which has come out of BB20, and that is the change to the injury table, or perhaps more specifically the casualty table. So again, per the analysis that we did before we were able to play this game, it was clear that there'd been an uptick in the amount of MNG type injuries that were going to be suffered in BB20. So it had gone from roughly speaking a third of all of your casualties to half of all of your casualties. Now on paper that didn't seem like a big deal, right? In practice, it has very much been a big deal, and particularly for those teams which naturally suffer more casualties. So, you know, your stunties, your AV7, Skaven, elves, etc. What has become apparent is that that seemingly small uptick has had just enough of an impact to change the experience of those kinds of teams from being one where they could just kind of naturally absorb those players and use journeyman to cover those temporary situations where they had players that weren't available, or players that had stat busts, or players that had niggling injuries, to one where it's becoming quite oppressive for those teams. They're unable to recover the position. They lose players from stat busts. They start too many games without key positionals because of the MNGs. So not only has their roster been damaged, but actually their effectiveness on any given game has been significantly impacted because they don't have their key players available to play in them. And in fact, for some of those teams over the course of the season, it actually becomes a real problem in terms of having healthy, fit, developed players on the roster. So I can speak from personal experience on this one because I played Wood Elves in the DBL, and at about the midpoint of the season I ended up with about 8 healthy players on the roster, and I was not able to recover that position. I effectively played with 3 or 4 journeymen for most of my games in the season, and obviously at the same time a number of those games where I was also missing, you know, good key developed players that were in my team. So, you know, I had block linemen, wrestle linemen, which are really, really important pieces to have on something like a Wood Elf team because they take pressure off the use of the War Dancers. And those players just simply weren't available from being MNG'd. And so this, I think, is a really big problem for those kinds of teams that expect to suffer more casualties. When we just looked at it from a purely kind of percentage statistical point of view, it just seemed like a fairly small uptick, and maybe it wouldn't have a big impact, but the practical reality has been that it's had a really, really significant impact. And I don't think it's quite in death spiral terms where the team actually becomes almost unplayable, but it becomes a very much a kind of one step forward, one step back situation, which is not a lot of fun, I would say, from one perspective, but also seriously limits the competitive ability of those teams as well. And again, as I touched on a minute ago, the money and the dedicated fans situation very much plays into this. So if you are one of those teams which is generating large amounts of money in each game, then obviously that helps with that scenario because you can replace those guys that you're losing on your team, and it puts you in a little bit of a better position. But unfortunately, I would say for the most part, this is just something that teams that suffer CAS are going to have to live with, and I think it generally puts them in an unfavourable place in the league-wide meta. So next really interesting change, and another one which was speculated about a lot before people had a chance to play League Play, was the change to the skill and advancement system in BB20. And I think it would be fair to say that in the two leagues that I played in, effectively there was a mass experiment in random skills. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that the changes to SPP gain, and by that I mean particularly things like the changes back to a D16 for MVP, which meant it was much more difficult to target key players on your team for advancement. Also the fact that they're only getting 4 SPP for MVP, and the fact that with the changes to passing ability that have generally made it more difficult for more players to pass the ball, means that getting that 1 SPP vanity pass that used to be a very common thing that people would do with an MVP player to just tip them over the edge to get that 6 SPP and get them to a skill, all of those things have combined to make it very much more difficult to get players to the 6 SPP, you know, the 14 SPP, the new gates for where they can select the skills they want. And what that means in practice is that you have a whole bunch of players as your league progresses. If you look at your fellow competitors' rosters, you'll see a whole bunch of players sitting on 4 SPP and or other similar numbers. You know, the guy that just scored 1 touchdown. And it's very much more difficult now in BB20 to get those players over the edge, get them to the gate where they can select a skill. So that's where random skills come in, because, you know, anyone with those kinds of SPP totals can now just take a punt. And, you know, there was a lot of speculation before people started playing League Play as to, you know, whether random skills would turn out to have any merit, be useful, what kind of players it might be useful on. And I think I would say largely most people have got the message that a random skill on a lino is generally a good use of your time or opportunity cost for a player that's not likely to get to a point where they can actually select a skill, and particularly by rolling on the general table as well, which is packed full of straight out useful and you know, good utility skills, and has less maybe pitfalls compared to some of the other tables. Now my take would be, looking at the results again across a couple of leagues, that it's not an unequivocal good or bad. It absolutely is as random as you would expect. You do get some hilarious combos of players who, you know, are picking up things like Dauntless and Shadowing, or, you know, Frenzy and Kick or whatever. But for the average unskilled lino who's just getting a punt and might end up with block, wrestle, tackle, you know, dirty player, kick, these are just good, useful skills. And if you're talking about a player that otherwise wouldn't be able to get a skill, and also a player that's only going to be paying a 10k increment cost to get that skill, then I think I would say that pretty much everyone has agreed that that's just a good use of time and opportunity. And I guess the key thing is it hasn't had a kind of league meta warping effect. That was one of the things which I was particularly intrigued by, as to whether, you know, some people would just get lucky, or it would favour certain kinds of teams or rosters particularly. And I think I would say the lesson I've seen is that it doesn't really. It very much is, you win some, you lose some. It hasn't made anybody overpowered. the cost is worth the investment. It doesn't pump up TV much, and so all of those things taken into consideration, it's not really had a league meta warping effect. So that's a good thing. That's a really good thing. So I think probably one of the other most interesting aspects about the new advancement system, of course, is the fact that you're now not going to be seeing those formerly double skills, what were now known as secondaries, and the stat ups. So across the leagues that I've played in, I think I saw 2 players who managed to get stat ups, a skink and a dwarf runner. So these are players that on their particular teams are naturally able to accrue large amounts of SPP by being the team's primary ball carrier and touchdown scorer. And you might naturally expect that some elves might be able to get into that position as well. Gutter runners, actually another good example. But I don't think we actually saw practically any elves or gutters go down the stat up route or get to the stat up route. But the key one probably is in doubles, and just to cover off stats, pretty much no one else is going to get to a position of being able to pick stat ups because they're so expensive. They're so absurdly expensive. It's such a huge investment of time, and for every game that you're not picking that stat up, or you're saving that stat up, obviously you're not using another skill, but for doubles, I think is a bigger deal, because if you think that effectively 1 out of 6 skill rolls in the old edition was a double, now those things have completely gone. So they were formerly pretty common, and that meant things like elves with guard, or skinks getting block, or whatever, has really disappeared from the meta. And I think that's a shame, because those added a lot to build variety and allowed people to go down different and perhaps unexpected routes that made the general league meta more interesting. And the other one is it's probably a bit of a power hit for certain teams, and again I would say probably particularly elves, because things like guard were so useful and so powerful when given to those kinds of teams. Again, Skaven, great example, getting a random guard lineman or whatever could really be quite a difference maker for those teams. For big guys, getting that block on a double was just absolutely brilliant. And largely those things have gone for the meta now. Of course, you can still save for them, and we definitely have seen a certain amount of that, people saving for block on big guys. But again, as with the aforementioned comments about the difficulty of targeting SPP gain on players, that has become more difficult. You can't just put your big guy and a couple of your other stars in for the MVP award anymore and see that steady progress of your best players towards more and more skills. You're very much beholden to the roll of the dice, unfortunately. And again, I would say this is an interesting area for league commissioners and league participants to think about in the leagues that they enter. We in the DBL at least heard many voices saying that they hate the new D16 system, they loved D3, they want it back, but also a lot of people just saying maybe something in the middle is more suitable now, a D8 or a D6 or something like that, just to kind of bring the scope in and allow a little bit more targeting increase of SPP. And I think there's a lot of merit to that. I think a key thing here that people perhaps don't consider is that certain teams hugely benefited from the D3 system, and I'm thinking of things like Lizards again, because the ability to effectively guarantee that Asaurus was the recipient of the MVP was a really big deal in advancing a key player on that team that would not otherwise have naturally accrued a lot of SPP or have easy ways of accruing SPP. So I do think people tend to forget that there were some hidden beneficiaries of the D3 system, and we've swung back away from that. But nevertheless, I think the key thing here probably is it's about player experience, and ultimately players find it frustrating as hell to just have SPP from the MVP land on some useless, crappy, injured player, or even worse, and I think this is a particularly egregious element of the rules, a journeyman who are still able to receive MVP in this edition. And I would certainly particularly recommend that that's changed, because that's pretty unpleasant experience, especially when you're in the position of not having enough money to hire that journeyman, and that's something that definitely did happen to me during my season as a Wood Elf coach. And again, it's more commonly going to happen to those teams that are getting beaten up, that have to hire more journeymen because they can't field their full rosters. And again, it is effectively a competitive nerf for those teams. So definitely something to consider in terms of your league rules going forward. So the final area that I wanted to cover off is just to talk about generally what we've seen in terms of league balance and competitiveness, and the roster changes and the new teams that have come in BB20, and how they seem to have performed in league play. So I guess I've mentioned it a couple of times now, and obviously have a bit of a personal perspective on this, but my general opinion is that agility teams, so Skaven and Elves particularly, have taken a hit in this new edition. Now we kind of knew that to a certain extent. We knew that the passing changes were going to hurt them a little bit, but what I would say is what I've seen in particular league environment is that the injury changes, changes to money, changes to SPP, all of these things have, I think, hurt the agility teams and made them less effective. Not to say competitive, because they absolutely still are very competitive, and you will absolutely still see Skaven and Elf teams doing the same kind of bullshit that they have always done in Blood Bowl, and I don't think that has gone away at all. Probably the amount of it has changed a bit. Now I'll add one caveat to that, and that is the new reroll system in BB20 that allows you to effectively go all in. That has I think helped those teams to a certain extent, and perhaps covers up some of the other problems that they face in the current league meta. But of course, every team is benefiting from that same thing. So it's not just a boost to those teams, it's been a boost to everyone in terms of the way the game is played. And then I think to a certain extent everyone has been adapting and learning that on any given turn more is possible from any team than has ever been possible before in Blood Bowl, because of the ability to just throw re-rolls at a problem. But just in terms of for those particular teams and races, I do think they've suffered, and they will continue to suffer in league play. And of course, conversely, that would imply that your kind of bashier teams and your teams which take less damage, which weren't planning on throwing the ball so much anyway, have had an implicit boost. I do think that's true. And I would say particularly regen teams have gained an advantage in this environment, because of the fact that, you know, no APO needed. You have a blanket 4+ chance to avoid all of the MNG, niggle, stat bus nonsense multiple times a game. Now I perceive that to be quite a significant advantage. What I don't have is, maybe haven't seen quite enough evidence of that, in obviously having only just played in 2 leagues so far, as to whether that really drives those kinds of teams to the top. I think most of the teams that have regen capabilities also have problems in roster building in this edition, particularly Necros, who have an absolute devil of a time getting all of their positionals and all of their re-rolls, and maybe have some other issues to deal with. For example, the fact that they're down to less ball carriers than they ever have before. But I think it's too early to kind of say how significant that is for those kinds of bashy hybrid regen teams. But my gut feeling is that, you know, this kind of league meta does favour them to a certain extent now. Absolutely the only thing really holding them back is problems with roster building and reroll access. But otherwise I would say definitely, I think as per predictions, it's a little bit more of a bash friendly meta. And of course, as we have touched on earlier in the video, it's certainly a friendly meta for stunty teams that are able to buy good stars, that want to foul a lot, that don't care so much about losing their cheap disposable linemen. Those teams are all very much favoured, I would say, in this edition. And just coming back to Snotlings again, because they are absolutely the pinnacle example of a team for which it seems that, you know, all the forces and rules of league play have kind of come to their advantage. And the key example being swarming. So again, swarming was addressed by Games Workshop in the most recent FAQ, and particularly it targeted swarming as used by Underworld teams. And again, if you've played Blood Bowl in any format, tournament play for example, you'll be well aware that Underworld have an extremely high win percentage in all measurable statistical data that's come out, and swarming is unequivocally a big part of that. I think that's another one where people knew it was good and they didn't quite realise how good it was, and it's proved to be very, very good. Swarming nerf that GW has implemented will definitely hurt the ability of Underworld rosters to take advantage of it. It doesn't make huge difference to Snotlings, and Snotlings I think still have a very troublesome place in a Blood Bowl league meta that allows them to play the inducements game, that allows them to have access to the stars that they want to buy, that sees them with, you know, 14 players on the pitch and another 6 in reserve, and, you know, they're blocking with Morg every turn, they're fouling with some disposable Snotlings every turn. I think if you are playing in any kind of league environment where the rules permit those kinds of things to happen, then you need to be prepared for Snotlings to warp your league meta to a certain extent. What we saw in the DBL was that the Snotling meta warping effect did drop off somewhat over time as other teams picked up their, you know, more blockers, more tacklers, more mighty blow, and just generally having maybe bigger rosters, better rosters. The impact of the Snotling teams became somewhat lessened, but in any short Blood Bowl league, then I would suggest that you need to be prepared for what Snotlings are going to bring to the table, because it can be absolutely devastating, meta warping, and perhaps most importantly, it can lead to games that people don't enjoy so much. Now obviously that's a highly subjective thing, but certainly there was a lot of feedback from people who felt that a certain amount of player agency had been taken away from them in their games against the stars and the Snotlings and the swarming. And so that's something that everyone needs to be aware of. In terms of the two brand new teams, I think Blackhawks seem a very, very solid choice. They have performed well in both of the leagues that I saw. They seem to be a kind of high tier 2 team, good bashers, you know, scoring potential, good kind of pitch control. They can foul well as well, and yeah, just generally a strong, good addition to the meta. Imperial Nobility seem a little underpowered. They are certainly overpriced, which is probably the main thing that contributes to that issue, and yeah, I would say that they seem a little bit underwhelming. They're very much held back by their pricing, and they do seem like a team that can become quite good with skills, but again, in shorter league formats, you might not see enough development to get them to that point where they really start to come into their own. I think they can certainly still be a strong team in the right hands, but they're definitely a bit more difficult to use than the Black Orcs. So we're at the end here of a bit of a quick look at some of the things that you might see or expect to see in shorter Blood Bowl tabletop leagues. I think had two really interesting seasons that I personally had played in. Saw a really strong variety of different teams be successful, which I think is great. It indicates that, you know, the meta is generally healthy and that BB20 hasn't caused any kind of sky is falling effects in terms of Blood Bowl league play, but at the same time I think it's you know, very much need to be aware of some of the things that I've discussed earlier in this video, because they can have significant impacts on how your league meta looks and how it feels as well for your players to play in. But overall, I would say Blood Bowl league play still in a really healthy, fun place. And of course, you know, as league players and commissioners, you know, we have a lot of agency in terms of how we shape the leagues that we play in to give the best experience for everyone. So hopefully some of the things that I've talked about in the video today will be useful and insightful for those of you that are in a position to do that. And I hope you'll have great fun playing your Blood Bowl leagues in future. See you around.